All point of views expressed on Shop Talk 360 are solely the point of views of the individuals and do not represent any company, organization, or group. Shop Talk 360, the industry's dedicated platform for commercial design, construction, and facilities. With more than 25 years building for national retail brands, an award-winning and best-selling author, keynote speaker, industry coach, and event producer, here's our host of Shop Talk 360, Grace Daly.
Hey, Shop Talkers, welcome to our Shop Talk 360 podcast. Really stoked to have our guest join us, Jerome Ryan. A real quick background, Jerome Ryan has over 20 years of experience in operational resilience and has a career that spans both consulting with firms such as PwC, Marsh Risk Consulting, and an industry where he's an executive and global head of business continuity and crisis management, both at Pfizer Incorporated and at State Street Bank. Wow. Very, very cool. Additionally, Jerome is a member of the JRyan International Board of Directors and has served as a past chairman. He is currently a director at BDO USA, where he helps lead the crisis management and business continuity consulting practice. Jerome, so excited to have you on our podcast. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Well, Grace, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk through some of these ideas as we enter into this new phase of the pandemic and start a conversation with your audience.
Absolutely. Just to give a little bit of background to our audience, I've known you from many past conferences, specifically from DRI as a board member. So I'm so excited to have you join us. And recently, I came across your white paper on LinkedIn. And I got to tell you, Jerome, I was almost relieved to see something that structured with just so much information out there. And I think I would say I was probably like the first person to email you as soon as you posted that. And here we are now sharing more. Okay, my first question, let's just dive in and share a little bit about your background. Share with our audience your background in business continuity and crisis management.
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I've been doing business continuity, crisis management, operational resilience, as we call the umbrella term today, for just over 20 years. And as you mentioned at the top of the podcast, I have a career it's actually kind of interesting because it spans both the consulting side of the house, but I've also sat in-house with Pfizer and State Street Bank. In running and owning those global programs. And as your listeners know, Pfizer and State Street Bank are both in two of the most highly regulated industries with banking and pharmaceutical. So it's been an interesting journey so far in both helping companies build them as a consultant and also working from the inside with management committees and boards of directors and the regulators that regulate both of those industries.
Okay, great. Now, during this pandemic, as many states are considering reopening businesses, what are the three things companies need to consider before they allow employees to re-enter the work sites?
Yeah, thanks. I think a lot of your listeners probably now know about the White House plan to reopen America. And the president has laid out a gating criteria for states to use. So they have some sort of a guidance on how they will begin to reopen the state economies. So the article that I wrote really starts to explore, what does a company do? What's the flip side of that coin? What's the criteria or the path forward for a company? And what we've done is we've developed a return to work plan for a number of our clients. And we boiled it down to answering three basic questions, right? You want to make this simple. It does not have to be overly complex. So the three questions a company needs to ask themselves, management executives, as they're trying to evaluate if they should reopen and allow employees to re-enter a work site is, first, can we do it? Second, should we do it? And third, how will we do it? And I'm going to walk through each of those right now, if that's okay. So the first question here, can we do, is really talking about physical access. And it really starts, again, at that governor level. Once a governor makes the determination that their state is going to begin to reopen in phases to non-essential workers, that's really your first cue that you can start to consider reopening, right? It's at the state level, they've indicated they're going to be opening, or they maybe have already made that decision. So once we get through that hurdle of work and movement restrictions being relaxed a little bit, companies then need to think about physical access into the site. A lot of our listeners probably work in buildings that they don't own. And so there's a landlord, there's a building owner, facilities manager, somebody that we need to also interact with before we can assume we can enter a site. And so we need to understand if there's any additional restrictions or hurdles that need to be crossed to get into the physical site. And then, of course, the third area here in the can we do it step is what supporting infrastructures are going to be available. So, when you come to work, there's a lot of things that happen behind the scenes that a lot of workers don't know about, right? There's the sanitation, there's security, there's cleaning and waste removal, and most importantly to me, there's food, right? I mean, if we have a cafeteria on site, or if we go out to, our employees go outside of the office to get food, are those services going to be available? And so that really takes us through the first hurdle, which is, can we do it? The second one is around, should we do it? And here we start to talk more in depth around health and safety issues. Certainly we're going to want to follow anything that's coming out from the CDC and the state and local and city guidance. And you want to be real careful here because there's a lot coming out right now. So you want to make sure that you understand, maybe just because your state has reopened partially, maybe the city or county that you're working in, or your office is located, or your manufacturing site, whatever it is that you have, they may have additional restrictions. But the real main point here is around health and safety of your employees. And certainly you don't want to react too soon and bring employees back until you can account for the health and safety aspects of what they'll experience when they return to the office. And the final one, of course, is, are there any personal protective equipment or other type of safety features that we need to prepare for, procure ahead of time? Now we move into the final question that executives need to work through, and that's the how will we do it question. And this really gets to the heart of a return to work plan. It talks about command and control structures, decision-making authorities. It even gets down to those checklists that a lot of your listeners are probably putting together right now around, what are those discrete steps that we need to consider and complete before we get people into the office. And then, of course, there's additional considerations like legal and liability issues. And, of course, childcare, right? I mean, a lot of states have suspended school for the rest of the year. And those of us with children certainly need to figure out how we would go back to a work site and then provide care for our children when schools aren't open. So those are the three questions that make up the heart of a return to work plan.
Okay, great. So Jerome, when you talk about can we return to work beyond government restrictions, what other considerations must companies think about?
Yeah, again, I think when we start to look back at the president's plan, and then again, of course, that the state and local area, there's a lot of guidance and in some cases mandates coming out. We need to start to think about, how are we going to continue to account for the health and safety of people when they re-enter the work site? Are we taking temperature checks as they come in? Are we asking people to fill out health questionnaires? Are we, again, providing personal and protective equipment like masks or other types of equipment for them when they get in? And then, of course, if somebody does get sick or exhibit potential symptoms of COVID-19, what's our contact tracing program look like? Are we going to be able to quickly map out who that sick or potentially sick person interacted with while they're at the office. Which floors did they visit? Which offices did they walk by? Who did they interact with? So those are some of the things that, in addition to just, can we get into the office from a physical aspect, those are additional health and safety items that companies are going to have to think through.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's a very holistic 360 approach. Okay, now my next question, let's dive in more into the should we return to work section of your plan. Help take me through the process of some of the questions and thoughts companies may work through in this stage.
Yeah, and I think, again, as we've mentioned a couple times, this is really the health and safety aspects. But when we start to consider re-entering the workspace, we need to start to think about continued social distancing. I've actually worked with a couple clients, and they actually print out big red X's on pieces of paper, and then every other cube they put that red X up, and so people know that which of cubes or workstations are available, which ones are not. Other companies are more already set up for a remote workforce, so they have a lot of hoteling. And what they're doing is they're just going into the system and, from an electronic perspective, blocking off those cubes, so somebody can reserve them. But there's other things that people are looking at, and it's closing down some of the common areas like a break room or a cafeteria, and it's those things that we need to figure out. Are those going to be sort of congregation points, and how do we account for those? So that's something that we need to think about before we bring people back into the office.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I know they do that with some of the essential businesses already, like the supermarkets, the grocers. They count in how many people are going in before, how many people are coming out before how many people are allowed in. So you're saying possibly similar scenarios such as that.
Yeah, Grace, I think you're right, and we're seeing that with some of the states putting that type of order together, where they're saying, maybe a given business is able to operate at 25% capacity or 50% capacity. And that's something that you'll have to look at, what your footprint is, right? Or what your occupancy limit is. If you're running a retail location where the public is coming in, certainly you may have somebody counting who's in the store. And once you've reached that limit, a line begins to form. I don't know about you, but where I live, that's how we go to the supermarket these days.
Sure. Yep.
I have to stand in line at Whole Foods or Stop and Shop before somebody comes out, and then I'm allowed back in. From an office environment perspective, it's a little bit easier, I think, because you have an understanding of who's in that office. Let's say there's an office for 300 people, and you have a 50% occupancy limit during this phased partial reopening. Then managers can then start to pick and choose who comes back, and you start to invite people in a limited fashion back into the office environment.
Okay. So now, there are a lot of different types of personal protective equipment. When it comes to masks, what are you seeing in the regulatory landscape or best practices for what types of masks employees were required to wear at work?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to refer our listeners to state guidance on this, because it does vary a bit potentially from state to state. So the best information is always going to be at your state website and at the governor level. But most people, most guidance that I've seen is really just following along with a face covering, and they're not necessarily dictating any type of particular mask level, like an N95 mask, which is certainly hard to come by these days. But again, you really want to look into the state and see if there's any particular nuances at the state level. There's also, depending on the state, they require masks to be used in certain areas. So when you look at For example, New York right now is requiring face coverings in public when social distancing is not possible. Maryland is saying you need to wear a face covering in public transportation and retail and food establishments. But then you get into some additional states, and this is, of course, going to change, day to day, hour by hour, probably. But
Sure.
Places like Connecticut and Pennsylvania, it appears that they're requiring face masks or facial coverings to be worn even in the office environment. So again, you have to go back to your state to see what particular instructions, either from a guidance or from a requirement mandate perspective, you may have to adhere to.
Okay. Yeah, and it seems like, to your point, it can change daily, or if not hourly. So it's important to keep in touch with that. And it's just interesting because I'm just thinking, from my background, having worked with national chains, many companies out there with national and international offices. To your point, it's just constantly checking what the local requirements are.
Yeah, and I think if you have a company that operates in more than one jurisdiction, it could even be different cities within a state, or certainly different states, and if you have an international company, there's a whole nother layer of complexity on top of that. But you really need to start to put together a regulatory book of record around this, and start to track it. It doesn't have to be anything overly complex, but if you have an Excel spreadsheet or some other type of repository where you start to just collect that data, so you understand what requirements are placed on you as a company, depending on where you operate.
Okay. Now I want to jump back into the work environment again real quickly, because now, do you think companies even need to return to an office environment for worksite? Haven't they come used to working remotely?
Yeah, Grace, this is a good question, because we are starting to have those conversations with some of our clients around, do we even need to go back to the office? What does this new normal look like? I think people are starting to realize that when we return to work, or we return to normal, it's not going to be a pre-pandemic normal. So it is a fair question to ask, do we need to go back to an office or some other work site? And again, this is a question that's going to be personal and vary by company to company. But let's take two examples here. So let's take the example of a professional services type firm, a consultant as a good example. Consultants, by and large, are set up to work remotely already. They have laptops. They are used to working on the road or working from home. They've got the technology already in place. And so for people in that professional services type of industry and consulting, it is a good question. Maybe we, permanently have certain numbers of people working from home. But on the other side of the equation, and let's take an example of let's say Ford, Ford and Chevy, right? They make cars, and thankfully right now they're also helping out with making some ventilators and other help. But by and large they make cars. You cannot make a Ford or a Chevy at home. You don't have that luxury to work from home and produce a manufactured item. So for those individuals, it's going to be really important that they get back into a site to do their job. But again, companies are going to have to think through this and figure out, do we really need to have everyone back in the same capacity and at the same volumes that we did pre-pandemic, or is there a new normal that's emerging, and do we need to adjust how we operate to meet that?
Okay, so take us through your last point, and as just maybe a dive deeper into how will we return to work.
Yeah. So again, what we're putting together right now for a number of our clients is a return to work plan that's focused on 3 levels. It's level 1 is really at the strategic nature, and it helps the C-suite and the executives figure out the hurdles and the questions that they need to deal with. We've covered some of those questions already around, can we do it, should we do it, and how will we do it? But again, level one of the plan is really that strategic component. Level two is where we peel back that onion a little bit, and we are laying out the objectives for each of the business units, both during a partial or limited reopening, and then at the full reopening stage. And I know the full reopening stage may be a ways off, maybe much later in this year or next year when a vaccine is widely available. But those are the objectives that the business units really want to accomplish in both of those phases. And then the level three, when we peel that onion back one more layer, that's really around the detailed checklist for each business unit and identifying any of those specific actions that need to take place. So again, we don't want to make this return to work plan overly complicated, but we certainly want to make sure that we're hitting the different levels that we need to hit and address to make sure that we're have a ready and open posture for our employees to return to.
I like what you said. I think it's fine balance of both, not to have it overly complicated, but making sure we cover all points. So that's very important.
Yeah, Grace, if I can expand on that, I guess a little bit more. This is a lot like it's part of business continuity and crisis management, right? So, when you're building those business continuity and crisis management plans, you don't want to be overly prescriptive because things change. And we've seen things change quite a bit, with this pandemic when, earlier this year, it was more China-centric. And then it quickly in late February or early March, the world, realized that this was going to be far more global in nature. And we had to, change our viewpoint once again. And so from the return to work plan, it needs to cover certain levels, but it also needs to have enough wiggle room so we can adjust it as new information becomes available.
Okay. Now, how should companies handle high-risk employees or even just employees who may not even feel comfortable coming back into the office environment?
Yeah, this is an interesting question here because there's going to be different categories of employees. There's going to be ones that are eager to get back and don't like working from home, and they like having that work space at the office or other work site. And then there's going to be some that can't because they have to take care of children because they're out of school or have other obligations. And then there's definitely going to be a segment that might be fearful of coming back, right? Even too soon, right? They may think it's too soon. And then the final category is really individuals who fit into one or more high-risk categories. And we certainly want to make sure that we take care of them because they're the most vulnerable to contracting and dealing with this virus. So, how do we handle high-risk employees or people who are fearful? I think what we do is really in that partial opening phase. If you're in an industry that allows it, really start to seek out people who are willing to re-enter the work site as a first phase. I would really, start to use words like the office is available if you wish to start working from the office, or you may begin to work. I'd stay away, if possible, with words like you must come back to work, you have to. And again, it's certainly that approach really lends itself to industries that have the ability to work remotely. There are industries like the Ford and Chevy example that we talked about, or people that work in a retail location, maybe a checkout associate at a Walmart or a supermarket. Again, they don't have that luxury to work from home. So it may be a little bit difficult for them when they're asked to return to work. But I think what companies really need to keep in mind is there should be an avenue for exceptions or accommodations for employees. And I think as long as the communication is there, that if an employee needs to speak to HR or to management in a private and confidential manner, to seek an exception or an accommodation, we absolutely need to make sure that that is in place and also communicated to the employees so they feel that they have an avenue to discuss those types of issues.
Yes, that sounds like a great approach. It's just also new, and as it continues to evolve and we're learning more about the pandemic, you hit on some really important notes to me as a writer. Like the words you choose are so important with the way you communicate. I've actually had some colleagues in my industry, from the restaurant industry, and they said that there was no communication whatsoever from leadership, and they've all been furloughed indefinitely. Whereas conversely, there were other chains where there's constant, even email communication, just saying, hey, this is what we're thinking of. We're not sure yet. We're going to see what else develops. So there's that vast difference of no communication or lack of, and then the constant communication to help folks get through this together. That's a very good point you bring up.
Yeah, let me expand on that just a bit there, because it's an important topic, and certainly communication is important during this time, because we're not in an office or other work site environment where we get to communicate more freely as we interact with our coworkers or management. And companies really need to think about how do they maintain that employee experience when we're all distributed and we're working from home.
Yeah, sure.
And I think communication is the key here. Make sure that your employees know what steps management is taking to navigate the current environment. Let them know when they may expect to return to work or begin to. Let them know what measures you're taking right now to ensure that the workspace is ready for them. And again, it's a communications, a back and forth too. It's not just a one-way communications. It's making sure that the employees have that avenue to ask questions, express concerns, and as we mentioned, before, seek out accommodations if that's something that they need.
Yep, and I love the phrase you used earlier. You said employee experience. We're in a culture for the last 20 years where there's so much focus on the client, the customer experience. So with this and the reopening of businesses, I like how you really focused in on that, because it's about the employee experience.
Yes.
Okay. Next question. Now, has infection rates continued to drop? There appears to be some potentially relatively calm period, hopefully over the summer months from June through November. And then there was concern about potential second wave that might reemerge. What should companies do to best take advantage of that expected quiet period between June and November?
Yeah, Grace, this is it's an interesting data points that we're looking at here, and again, these things could obviously change as new data comes in, but we do appear to be in the United States on the downward side of the initial surge of COVID-19, both cases and fatalities. And the data that we're seeing right now appears to indicate that beginning sometime in June, there's going to be a relative calm period emerge, and that may last into the November timeframe, so towards the middle or end of the fall. So you've got this period, anticipated period of calmness when there aren't going to be potentially as many cases. It's also the period where we're going to start to bring our workers back in a phased but safe and thoughtful manner. And what we should do, and what we're working with our clients on, even now, as we're beginning to return to work, we're starting to work with some of our clients at BDO around the after action report. And it's starting to look back and say, okay, what went well over the last 6-8 weeks? What could we have done better? Where are those gaps? And what do we need to do to fix those gaps? What's that plan remediation look like? And so, the two things that I would do over the summer months is one, again, develop that after action report and remediation plan, but also take advantage of that period of time to build out or augment, if you happen to have already had a business continuity, crisis management, or pandemic plan, but either build those out if you didn't have any, or start to make program improvements, because it's possible that a reemergence of cases could begin in the fall and last even into 2021. Before there is a widely available vaccine or herd immunity, as you may hear some of the talking heads talk about on the news. But I think what's going to happen is you've got a lot of consumers and clients were probably somewhat forgiving during this first wave because it all hit us like a ton of bricks. And we were all really in it together. And I think if we do have a resurgence in later this year, I think there's going to be a split between companies that are better prepared and those that are not prepared. So you're already seeing this over the last couple of weeks with some of the companies that we interact with that have started to adapt to this, somewhat new normal. One of the large national pizza chains promoting the fact that they've got this seal over their pizza box, much like we've become accustomed to when you buy medicine at the pharmacy. It's sealed up so we know nobody's tampered with it. But they've got this tamper-proof seal. It helps the consumer feel comfortable that pizza hasn't been touched from the oven through the delivery, right?
Sure.
And car companies are I've seen a lot of ads with contactless delivery of cars. And a lot of companies are doing really well with this. But other companies haven't done as well. And I think, again, if you have that business continuity plan in place, if you've really thought through the risk management aspects of the pandemic and a possible resurgence, I think you're going to be in a much better place when a potential resurgence happens versus those that don't. It's really going to be one of those disruptive type of events that picks winners and losers. And again, the companies that are innovative and thinking already, they're likely to be, some of the winners, and the ones that think this is more, let's just take a wait and see approach, and things are going to go back to exactly the same way as they were before the pandemic. I think they may be in for a rude awakening.
Yeah, no, you bring up some very good points. So basically, like you said, with this first pandemic, when it hit us like a ton of bricks. You said it so eloquently, we're all in this together. But then I agree with you. For the second wave, I personally feel that it's irresponsible if someone doesn't have a plan in place. Even if they're not progressive thinkers or they're not sure of how to go about it, then that's why they should reach out and work with the experts in business continuity and disaster recovery industry to get to that point. Otherwise, it errs on being irresponsible, I think.
Yeah, you're right. And one of the big drivers I am predicting in this new normal is an increased level of clients' expectations and inspections of their critical third parties, business continuity, crisis management, and resiliency plans. In the financial services world, we're more accustomed to this idea of third-party risk management because there have been some regulations for the last couple of years that require banks to verify the soundness and recoverability of their critical third parties. But what we're seeing now is moving into other industries, especially ones that don't necessarily have regulations, but it's really driven from the customer side. Now I've actually had two clients very recently that was really the driver for why they engaged with me to build a operational resiliency plan. One client had an existing customer and it was one of their largest. And that customer said, look, if you don't have a business continuity plan, we are going to pull our business and go work with somebody else.
Sure.
And the other client that I had, it was a little bit more proactive, but they had a letter from a potential client, one that was considering doing business with them. And it said the same thing. Part of our due diligence is to verify that you actually have a working, valid, and tested business continuity and crisis management plan. And that's really the barrier to entry if you want to do business with us.
Mm-hmm.
So, for your listeners, especially if they're in maybe the less regulated areas, if you haven't received these type of third-party risk management mandates, requirements from some of your large customers, I expect that you're going to fairly soon, and that's something you need to prepare for. You can really use business continuity and crisis management as a competitive advantage. And I've worked with some of my clients to do just that. And what we do is, when you're making a pitch to win new business, of course you go through product or service that potential client is interested in. You explain why you're great in that area and why you've got the best and the brightest people or the highest quality of product. But then you should also include some information around that you have a business continuity plan, you have this operational resiliency plan. And not only do we have the best people to provide the best services or to build the best products, but we're not going to let our disaster become your disaster. We have a plan in place to continue supplying you with those products and services that you want. And it really becomes a competitive advantage. So I think clients and our listeners really need to think through that and understand that it's a twofold item here. One, it's likely going to be mandated upon you by your customers. And two, if you're proactive about it, you can use it as a competitive advantage to get a leg up on your competition and win more business.
Absolutely. Okay, I like that. That's great sound advice. That's going to help us flow into the new normal. So that's wonderful. Thank you, Jerome. So now we've been talking a lot about businesses and workplaces. Now, as we wrap up, what's your advice on what we can do at our own homes with our families to ensure we're continuing to be safe?
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, we're thinking about it in my household, and I'm pretty sure every household across America and elsewhere is thinking through this as well. And my advice here is always to look towards the authorities in this area. So, make sure you understand what your governor in the United States, or if you're outside of the U.S., what your government is telling you are the best practices and or regulations, right? It could be requirements as well. But staying safe in the home is really comes down to just be smart. Take the precautions that we've all been told by various local and national government authorities about staying safe, wearing face coverings when it's appropriate to do so, washing our hands, making sure that we maintain that social distance when we're out in public. I think that's really the best advice. And again, I'm not a doctor, so I certainly want your listeners to understand that I would refer them to any authoritative resources here. But that's what we're doing in my household, and certainly I think that's pretty good advice for many other households as well.
Well, thank you, Jerome. I certainly really appreciated our discussion. I think there's a lot folks can learn, especially as we're looking to reopen businesses. Now, lastly, please share with our audience where you can be reached at, or your website or your email, phone.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Grace. So encourage people to connect with me. I'd love to continue the discussion here. I can be found right on LinkedIn, and it's Jerome P. Ryan. is my LinkedIn handle name. And also, if you want to reach out to me directly, my BDO email address is JRyan@BDO.com. Again, JRYAN@BDO.com. And, I'd really love to continue the conversation if people have additional questions. I also have a presentation that accompanies the article that I wrote that can be found right on BDO.com. We have this amazing crisis response resource center that we've developed. So I'll certainly direct your listeners there. Again, go to BDO.com, and right on that homepage, you'll see a link to the crisis response resource center. And that includes a link to my article on preparing to return to work in the new normal. But I'd love to connect with anybody if they have additional questions or want to talk more about BDO's capabilities to support them as they continue to build their resilience capabilities. So thanks again for having me on your podcast, Grace.
Jerome Ryan, so excited that we were able to get this together. And I'm looking forward to future, if not podcasts, maybe future video snippets that we can share, because I think this is a continued discussion. So let's definitely check in again soon and schedule some more time.
Would love to join you again in the future. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Jerome.
Thanks for joining Shop Talk 360, real conversations in the commercial design, construction, and facilities industry. You can reach out to us at grace@gracedaily.com.